dirty beneath the streets. Suddenly, they find something horrifying: human bones, an orange backpack, and a red bicycle deep inside a tunnel. The bones had been there for many years. Someone had placed them there to hide them. But who was this person, and who killed them so brutally? In 2005, a young man who worked delivering food by bicycle disappeared forever during a severe storm. His mother searched for him relentlessly for 17 years. The police were never able to solve the case. But when the truth finally came to light, no one could believe what had happened. The story is so cruel, so terrible, it feels impossible. The killer was someone nobody ever suspected, and the reason for the crime was the most painful of all. This is a true story about secrets, betrayal, and a vengeance that turned into the most tragic event a family could endure. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more cases like this, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. On October 15th, 2005, a violent storm struck the outskirts of Guadalajara, Jalisco. The streets turned into raging rivers, and residents took refuge in their homes, waiting for the fury of the skies to pass. Amidst this natural chaos, Miguel Hernandez Solis, 23 years old, vanished without a trace. Miguel worked as a delivery man for a local food company, a precursor to what would later become modern delivery platforms. He wore the standard uniform, a long-sleeved red shirt with a white logo on the chest, black athletic pants, dark sneakers, and a red helmet with a visor. His work tools were an old red bicycle and a square orange thermal backpack he always carried. On his deliveries, the company reported his disappearance. 3 days later, when Miguel failed to show up for work and stopped answering calls, his supervisor, Roberto Mendoza, told authorities that the young man had gone out to make routine deliveries in the Revolucion neighborhood, a middle-class area where the houses stood close together on narrow streets. The initial investigation was superficial. Guadalajara's municipal police barely allocated resources to look for a missing delivery man during a storm. Officers assumed Miguel had run away, perhaps to escape personal or financial troubles. His case was shelved after just 2 weeks of fruitless searching. Miguel's family, made up of his widowed mother, Carmen Solis, and younger sister Lucia, never stopped looking. Carmen walked the streets for months, posting flyers with her son's photo on walls and poles. The image showed a kind-faced young man with wavy black hair and a shy smile that contrasted with the harshness of his job. The residents of the Revolucion neighborhood were questioned only briefly. Some recalled seeing the delivery man on his bike that stormy afternoon, but no one could provide specific details about his last known location. The storm had erased any physical trace that might lead to answers. Mexico, in 2005, was a country in transition. The informal economy thrived in large cities, and young people like Miguel saw delivery work as a way to earn a living. Modest but honorable. Delivery services operated mainly by phone, with workers setting their own routes. Unlike the digital platforms we know today, Miguel had started working as a deliverer man 6 months before his disappearance. He came from a humble family in the Barrio de la Experiencia, where he grew up with his mother after his father abandoned them when he was just 8. Carmen worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families, struggling to support her 2 children. From a young age, Miguel was known for being quiet but responsible. His co-workers described him as dependable, never missing a shift, and very familiar with the city streets. He had built up a steady clientele, especially in the Revolucion neighborhood, where some families specifically requested his service Revolucion in 2005. was a snapshot of Mexican middle-class life, two-story homes with small front gardens. Traditional families where the fathers worked downtown and mothers stayed home. It was a peaceful neighborhood where children played in the streets, and everyone knew each other. Authorities at the time had limited resources to investigate disappearances, especially of lower-income individuals. Cases like Miguel's were often dismissed as voluntary runaways or accidents, without thorough investigation. This institutional neglect was particularly evident in cases involving working-class youth. Miguel's mother, Carmen, faced bureaucratic indifference when she demanded a deeper investigation. Officers assured her her son had probably left to seek better opportunities elsewhere, an explanation she never accepted. Knowing her son's responsible nature, while the official investigation faded, certain details of Miguel's life remained hidden. He had developed a specific routine when delivering to the Revolucion neighborhood, particularly to a house on Morelos Street, number 247. This residence belonged to the Vargas family, Eduardo Vargas, a 45-year-old accountant at a construction firm, and his wife, Sofia Mendoza de Vargas, a 38-year-old homemaker. Eduardo had a strict work schedule, leaving the house at 7 a.m. and returning precisely at 6:30 p.m. Miguel had noticed this predictable pattern during his many visits to the neighborhood. Sofia had developed a habit of ordering food that always coincided with her husband's absence. The Vargas house was typical for the area: yellow-painted brick, a small wrought iron gate, and a front garden with ornamental plants. Inside, it was decorated with dark wooden furniture and family photos showing Eduardo and Sofia throughout their war year marriage. Sofia began ordering food 3 times a week, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. The orders were consistent: food for one person, usually elaborate dishes from restaurants downtown. From the start, Miguel noticed the woman always looked perfectly groomed, hairstyled, makeup flawless, unusual for someone supposedly relaxing. At home, the initial encounters were strictly professional. Miguel would deliver the food, collect the payment, always with a generous tip, and leave. But gradually, Sofia began inviting him inside, saying she needed change or wanted to offer him a drink on hot days. These interactions slowly became more intimate. Sofia, an attractive woman with light brown hair and green eyes, found in Miguel an escape from the monotony of her passionless marriage. Miguel, on the other hand, was flattered by the attention of an older, wealthier woman. Their secret meetings intensified in the months before Miguel's disappearance. Food deliveries became the perfect excuse for Sofia to continue her extramarital affair. Miguel even adjusted his delivery route to ensure he visited the Vargas home during Eduardo's absence. Sofia's marriage had lost its passion long ago. Eduardo, consumed by work and routine, barely paid attention to his wife. The couple had no children, a fact that caused tension, and which Sofia viewed as a personal failure. Miguel's arrival represented an emotional adventure she thought was no longer possible to Miguel. Sofia was not only a romantic partner, but a maternal figure he had partly lost when his father left. The age and class difference created a complicated dynamic. Miguel felt both cared for and desired. Sofia gave him extra money, new clothes, and the emotional attention he had lacked for most of his life. The encounters followed a set pattern. Miguel would arrive at the house between 2 o'clock and 3 p.m., pretending to deliver food, and would stay inside for about an hour. Sofia had carefully calculated the timing to avoid any suspicion from neighbors or, more importantly, from her husband. The relationship remained secret for 5 months. Miguel never told anyone about it, not even his mother or sister. To Carmen, her son had simply built a steady client base that gave him good earnings. The young man came home with more money than his job would normally produce. But Carmen assumed it was thanks to generous tips from satisfied customers. Meanwhile, Eduardo Vargas was completely unaware of the betrayal happening in his own home. His rigid work schedule and methodical personality had made him a predictable man, something Sofia had learned to exploit. The accountant returned home each evening at 6:30, had dinner with his wife, and spent the nights watching television or reviewing work documents. The afternoon of October 15, 2005 began like any other for Miguel Hernandez. He headed to work in his crisp uniform, riding his red bicycle and aware that it would be the last day of his life. The grey clouds gathering on the horizon signaled the storm that would change the fate of several families Miguel had planned. His usual route, which included a visit to Sofia Vargas's home. That morning, Sofia had called to place her usual order, confirming that Eduardo would be in a work meeting that was expected to last late into the evening. However, what neither of them knew was that the meeting had been cancelled due to the worsening weather. Eduardo Vargas decided to head home early that day. Around 3 p.m., the accountant had spent the morning reviewing financial records in his office, but the intensity of the rainfall convinced him it was better to end the workday early. He drove his grey Subaru through the increasingly flooded streets. Eager to reach the safety of his home, Miguel arrived at the Vargas house at approximately 2:45 p.m. The rain had started as a light drizzle but was intensifying quickly. Sofia greeted him at the door with her usual smile, wearing a light blue dress she had chosen specifically for the occasion. The orange thermal backpack was left by the door, along with the red helmet Miguel removed from his head. Once inside, the two lovers went to the living room, where Sofia had prepared coffee and some snacks. Their conversation flowed naturally, blending physical intimacy with the emotional connection that had defined their relationship over the past few months. Miguel talked about his family, his dream of saving enough money to help his mother, and perhaps studying a technical career. Sofia, in turn, shared her marital frustrations and unfulfilled dreams. She had studied executive secretarial work before marrying, but Eduardo had convinced her it was better to dedicate herself to the home. Now, at 38, she felt trapped in a life she had not fully chosen. The intimacy of the moment was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Eduardo had come home much earlier than expected, soaked from the torrential downpour now battering the city. His footsteps in the entrance hallway echoed like a death sentence in the ears of Sofia and Miguel. Eduardo Vargas stepped into his home, shaking the rain from his clothes, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. He hung his soaked jacket on the coat rack and headed toward the kitchen to prepare something warm. That's when he noticed the orange thermal backpack and the red helmet, abandoned by the door. Eduardo's initial confusion quickly turned into suspicion. His wife hadn't mentioned any scheduled deliveries that afternoon, and the delivery gear left in the house at such an odd hour seemed off. Quietly, he followed the sound of whispering voices coming from the living room. The scene, Eduardo discovered, shattered his world in seconds. Sofia and Miguel were on the couch, in a position that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The betrayal was not just physical, it was emotional, clear in the way they spoke and touched each other. 15 years of marriage crumbled before his eyes in a single, devastating instant. The scream of shock and rage Eduardo let out instantly alerted the lovers to his presence. Sofia jumped away from Miguel, trying to cover herself and stammer out incoherent explanations. Miguel quickly stood up, fully aware he had been caught in a situation that could end very badly. Eduardo, a man normally calm and methodical, felt a fury he had never experienced before. The humiliation of being betrayed in his own home by his wife and a young man he had unknowingly welcomed into it unleashed a violence he didn't know he possessed. His hands trembled as he processed the magnitude of the betrayal. Miguel tried to explain, but the words caught in his throat. He knew there was no possible justification for what Eduardo had just seen. The young man moved toward the door, hoping to grab his belongings and leave before the situation escalated further. But Eduardo intercepted him in the hallway, blocking his exit. A physical confrontation was inevitable. Eduardo, driven by a toxic mix of rage, betrayal, and shame, violently shoved Miguel against the wall. The younger man, smaller and caught off guard, couldn't defend himself effectively. The struggle intensified when Eduardo grabbed a heavy object from the hallway tabula, glass ashtray that had been a wedding gift. The blow Eduardo delivered with the ashtray was fatal. The impact to Miguel's head caused a skull fracture, rendering him unconscious immediately. Sophia screamed in horror at the sight of blood gushing from the wound, staining the mosaic-tiled floor. Still gripped by rage, Eduardo didn't initially realize the gravity of what he had done. Miguel fell to the ground with a dull thud that echoed through the now silent house, except for Sophia's hysterical sobs. The torrential rain pounding the windows provided a sinister soundtrack to the tragedy unfolding inside. Eduardo stood, panting, the bloodied ashtray still in his hands as the reality of his actions began to sink in. The minutes that followed were critical. Eduardo checked Miguel's pulse and confirmed what he feared: the young man was dead. The head injury had been too severe, and the internal bleeding had been fatal. Sophia, in shock, could barely string together a coherent sentence through her sobs. Eduardo's calculating mind, honed by years of accounting work, began analyzing the situation with a coldness that surprised even him. He had killed a man in his own home, and although it had happened in a blind rage, he knew the authorities would not treat it sympathetically. His life, his career, his future were all at stake. The decision to hide the crime was made in a matter of minutes. Eduardo knew the storm provided the perfect cover to dispose of the body unnoticed. The Revolucion neighborhood had an old drainage system with several inspection chambers and manholes that could serve his grim purpose. Sophia, traumatized but now an unwilling accomplice, helped her husband wrap Miguel's body in a tarp. Eduardo kept in the garage. The orange backpack and red helmet were also included in the gruesome bundle. Miguel's red bicycle, which had been left outside in the street, was retrieved under the cover of the heavy rain. Eduardo loaded the body into his car, taking advantage of the empty streets caused by the storm. 3 blocks from his house, at the intersection of Hidalgo and Juarez, there was a manhole cover he had noted during his morning walks. The chamber was deep and rarely inspected by city officials. The operation to dispose of Miguel's body required a precision that only desperation could inspire. Eduardo waited until 2 a.m., when the storm reached its peak and the streets had become raging rivers. With Sophia's reluctant help, he transported the wrapped body to the chosen manhole. The cover was heavy, but adrenaline and fear gave Eduardo the strength to lift it. The chamber was deeper than he had imagined, about 4 meters, and connected to an underground drainage tunnel system dating back decades. Miguel was thrown into the shaft along with his orange thermal backpack and red helmet. The red bicycle posed an additional challenge. Eduardo partially disassembled it to fit it through the opening of the manhole. The wheels were separated from the frame, and each piece was carefully dropped into the pit. The stormwater running through the sewers would help wash away any evidence into the deeper parts of the drainage system. Back at the house, Eduardo and Sofia meticulously cleaned any traces of blood or evidence of the crime. The tiled hallway was scrubbed with bleach, and the crystal ashtray was destroyed and discarded in various neighborhood trash bins. The clothes they had worn that night were burned in the backyard, taking advantage of the rain to conceal the smoke. Eduardo crafted an alibi for both of them. If anyone asked, they had been home all afternoon due to the storm, watching TV and having dinner together. Sofia, still in shock, followed her husband's instructions like an automaton. The trauma had left her unable to think clearly or question Eduardo's decisions. The days that followed were a psychological torment for both of them. Eduardo returned to work, appearing normal, but Sofia began showing symptoms of post-stress insomnia, nightmares, and panic attacks. She stopped going out unless absolutely necessary and avoided any interaction with neighbors who might ask questions. When the police conducted routine investigations into Miguel's disappearance, the Vargas couple was briefly questioned as part of standard procedure. Eduardo responded with calculated calm, saying he vaguely remembered seeing the delivery boy in the neighborhood but denied any significant interaction. Sofia remained silent during the interview, something the officers chalked up to natural shyness. The years after Miguel's murder deeply changed the Vargas lives. Eduardo became even more obsessive-compulsive, controlling every aspect of his daily routine to maintain a sense of order in contrast to the best emotional chaos of his personal life. Work became his refuge, where numbers and formulas gave him comfort. Sofia never fully recovered from the trauma. The woman who had once been lively and flirtatious turned into a withdrawn, melancholic figure. She developed severe agoraphobia and avoided leaving the house except for the most essential needs. Her marriage with Eduardo became a silent cohabitation, defined by shared guilt and the dark secret that bound them. Together, Miguel's family never stopped searching for him. Carmen Solis became a familiar figure in government offices, constantly pushing for new investigations and keeping her son's case alive. Lucia, Miguel's younger sister, grew up obsessed with finding answers. In 2010, 5 years after his disappearance, Carmen organized a march in memory of Miguel and other missing persons in Guadalajara. The demonstration attracted the attention of local media and human rights organizations but failed to produce new leads. Eduardo watched the news coverage from the safety of his living room, feeling a mix of guilt and relief for not being discovered. Over the years, the drainage system where Miguel's remains lay underwent several upgrades. However, the specific manhole where Eduardo had hidden the body remained untouched. Seasonal rains flushed water through the underground tunnels, but the area where Miguel's bones rested stayed relatively dry and isolated. Eduardo developed compulsive rituals tied to the date of the crime. Every October 15th, he feigned illness to stay home, spending the day in a state of extreme anxiety. Sofia, for her part, had blocked out most memories of the event, but suffered from severe depressive episodes that mysteriously coincided with key dates. In 2020, 15 years after the crime, Eduardo was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, conditions his doctors attributed to chronic stress. Sofia developed generalized anxiety disorder that required constant medication. Their marriage survived, but only as an empty shell of what it once had been. On March 8, 2022, a municipal work crew was performing routine maintenance on the drainage system in Colonia Revolucion. Jose Martinez, the crew supervisor, was inspecting several manholes reported to have flow problems during the recent rainy season. The team carried gas detectors and breathing equipment, standard procedure for confined space work. When workers removed the manhole cover at the intersection of Hidalgo and Juarez, they immediately noticed a strange odor that didn't match typical sewer gases. Jose descended into the shaft with a high-powered flashlight and made a discovery that would change everything. Partially buried in sediment were human bones, along with objects clearly out of place in a sewer system. The remains included a human skeleton in advanced decomposition, an orange thermal backpack with a visible logo, a shattered red helmet, and parts of a disassembled bicycle. With 20 years of experience in municipal work, Jose immediately recognized the evidence of a crime. The police were notified, and the area was cordoned off as a crime scene. Forensic analysis revealed the bones belonged to a young man, approximately 20 to 25 years old at the time of death. A severe cranial fracture suggested a violent trauma as the cause. The found items were identified as belonging to a food delivery worker, and the thermal backpack still contained partially preserved documents bearing the name Miguel Hernandez Solis. Detective Ana Ruiz, assigned to the case, quickly connected the findings to the missing persons report from 2005. Police records were reviewed, and the original investigation was reopened with significantly more resources. Miguel's family was notified, and Carmen Solis finally received the answers she had sought for 17 years. The investigation focused on Miguel's regular delivery route and his frequent clients. Although incomplete after so many years, the records from the delivery company listed the Vargas household as a frequent stop in the months before Miguel's disappearance. Eduardo and Sofia were interrogated again, this time as prime suspects. 17 years of guilt and secrecy had eroded their psychological defenses. Sofia, particularly fragile after years of untreated trauma, broke down during questioning and confessed everything about the affair and the events of October 15, 2005. Her confession led to Eduardo's arrest for homicide. During the legal proceedings, the most devastating detail emerged. DNA analysis revealed that Miguel Hernandez Solis was Eduardo Vargas' biological son. The young man had been given up for adoption when Eduardo was just 20 years old. Decision he had kept secret even from his wife. Unknowingly, Eduardo had murdered his own son, the child he had abandoned 18 years earlier. This Greek tragedy of a revelation utterly destroyed the man who had lived with the weight of his crime for 17 years. During his trial, Eduardo fully confessed, expressing a remorse that went beyond any hope for redemption. Miguel Hernandez Solis' story became a symbol of the tragedies born from family secrets, parental abandonment, and domestic violence. Carmen Solis was finally able to bury her son with dignity, though learning the true identity of his killer added a horror she had never imagined. Eduardo Vargas was sentenced to 30 years in prison for homicide. Sofia received a reduced sentence for cooperating with authorities, but her life was left in ruins by the weight of the tragedy. Colonia Revolucion was never the same after the story came to light, a reminder that the darkest secrets often lie behind the most ordinary facades. The case was officially closed after 17 years, but it left lasting lessons about the consequences of decisions made in moments of blind passion, and the importance of confronting the past before it becomes a force that destroys the present.